Greetings everyone, I'm Mar, and once again this is my opinion. As you can tell from the fact that you're seeing me, it's another off-the-cuff review, and it is of a film from the Universal Classic Horror cycle that I've only seen a handful of times, but I can honestly say it is slowly becoming one of my favorites. And that, of course, is the James Whale directed film starring Claude Rains, H.G. Wells' The Invisible Man. This is my DVD copy of it. This was a lucky buy because I got this at the Goodwill by where I live. Brand new in the case. So this was a brand new find. I just haven't checked how much it'd be online to try to get that, but less than $5, so score! This film was released in 1933 on the heels of Universal's other successful films, Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, and like the first two, it is an adaptation of a novel. Now, as Universal was making it, they went through dozens of drafts for this book, many of which were very, very loose. I mean, you had a couple set on Mars, you had one set in Tsarist Russia. You turn invisible, comrade. When the screenwriter R.C. Sheriff finally was hired to write another draft, he asked to see the novel so he could actually look at the material he was adapting. The people at Universal were like, we don't have it. So he had to go find it. He found a copy in a used bookstore, read through it, and he's like, yeah, this story's pretty good. This would actually make a good film as it is. And he adapted the novel to screen as is. He only made some slight alterations, which I will get to. Now, the film is set in the then modern era. Our main character is a man named Griffin, who is a scientist. As we're introduced to him, we see that not all is right with him. I mean, he enters a establishment that is a bar in an inn. He's dressed in a long coat. He has this weird mask apparatus on his head, complete with goggles, a fake-looking nose, and a hat. And even the people at the bar are a little skittish of him. They just don't like the look of him. He gets a room, and he starts to do his experiments. He covers his mouth when the tavern keeper's wife comes to bring him food like this, still talking, and he is very secluded and secretive. And as unseen time passes, it scares away a lot of the customers, and eventually, after he causes a little fight with the owner, he is shown to be invisible. I just love the nonchalant way that the constable goes off with it. He's invisible, that's what's the matter with him. And he escapes in a scene where he slowly reveals that he's invisible. This scene shows the special effects for this film off very well. For 1933, these effects are amazing, and they still look great today. I mean, you can see the edges of the matte lines, but they still look amazing. And how they did this is that for those scenes, they had Claude Rains wear black velvet and record him in front of a black screen. So it was essentially green screen before green screen. And then through editing, they seamlessly put him into the film. A lot of hard work, but it paid off and it looks great on screen. For this era, this is one of three films I would cite for how important they are to cinema history when it comes to special effects. This one, obviously, for what I just mentioned. King Kong for its use of stop motion and mixing it with live action actors. And Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, mainly for its amazing transformation sequence, and also as an aside for the fact it's one of the few horror movies to get nominated for an Academy Award for acting and win. That's a whole rant for another day, though. Of course, you can imagine Griffin escapes, and this leads into one of the biggest differences from what I've read between the novel and the movie, and that is Griffin has a love interest. In the novel, he has no such love interest. Now, the reason I think Sheriff put this love interest into the film was to try to anchor Griffin and thus make him relatable to the audience, which for the 1930s, the early era of talkies, would make sense. Because if he was a totally black character and the fact that he had no redeeming qualities, no one would care. But here, it makes him a little gray, like a light gray. You don't approve of his methods. I mean, he starts murdering people. But you do sympathize with him just a little bit because the conversation he has with his fiancée you do see that his intentions started out noble. It's just his experiments drove him mad. It's that whole thing, there are some things that science isn't supposed to meddle with that you see in a lot of science fiction movies that involve scientists and experiments. This ties into the other major difference from the novel, and that is apparently Griffin is insane from the get-go before he even becomes invisible, whereas here his invisibility is what makes him insane. It makes his descent all the more tragic because it's his own experiments that cause it and not him just using it and going, yes, 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 yes. He does do that, but it's not like he just goes invisible and goes, hey, I can do this now. It's him going invisible, trying to fix it, and then slowly his descent into it as the days and weeks eat away at him. Claude Rains was perfectly cast as this character. He just has that speaking voice. It's a very distinct voice, and apparently it's his voice that actually helped him get hired. While he had made a film before during the silent era, this was his first talkie, and he was mainly a stage actor. And one of his screen tests was heard by Whale, and Whale was like, yeah, we should get him. Bring him in. And considering that Griffin is mainly heard and only seen, through bandages, you need an actor that, one, can speak clearly, and two, his voice can help carry it. And since Rains has a very distinct voice, that helps. The only time we see him on screen is that famous last shot, which also shows off the great special effects in this film, where it's a very slow fade in. Kind of think something similar to the Wolfman transformation that you see in some of the later Wolfman films, where you slowly see the makeup change. Imagine going from invisible to visible. That's that scene. Then, of course, there's other spectacle scenes, but they don't really get talked about much, like the car crash, the train crash. It's mainly the things involving the invisibility, and there's other subtle ones that you're like, yeah, they probably did a simple fix with that, like the bike. I can imagine that was a simple thing, but probably a little bit of a headache when they were trying to get the shots set up. An interesting story involving Rains in this film happened years after it was released, when he took his daughter to go see it. Apparently, since he was wearing a scarf for it, since it was a cold day, but when he spoke, the person at the ticket counter recognized his voice and offered him to come inside. And I hear that he tried to get him to come in for free, but Rains said no, which I can understand. I mean, even if you're famous like that, you don't want to abuse your celebrity too much. And as the film was going on, he was even telling his daughter the making of the film, and it eventually turned to him just essentially telling all the patrons of it. Essentially, this was a audio commentary before there were audio commentary, which I'm jealous of all the fans that must have been in that viewing. Could you imagine how cool it would have been to be sitting there watching The Invisible Man with Claude Rains in the audience? That'd be like watching the original Halloween with John Carpenter and Jamie Lee Curtis in attendance, and them talking about how the film was shot. As James Rolfe, the angry video game nerd, once said, this is easily the funniest of the Universal classic horror films. I mean, Bride of Frankenstein did have some dark humor in it, and there were a couple moments in Dracula that were comedic, mainly from how over the top the Renfield character is, and it's kind of uncomfortable funny. This one, there's a lot of humor, mainly stemming from the fact that our main character is invisible and he is slightly insane. I mean, there's one scene where he's just going with a bunch of pants, scaring someone, singing the song, Here We Go Gathering Nuts in May. Then his rampage through the city at the beginning, where he's like messing with all the people, where he steals a bike, throws it at him, does other stuff, and then the montage, and when he causes a bunch of mayhem, like he steals some money and starts throwing money to the people. To name a few. It's just so chuckle-worthy, you can't help but smile at it, even though it is also dealing with murder at the same time. So I would define this also as black comedy, but it's lighter black comedy compared to what's, say, in Bride of Frankenstein. But since it's made by the same director, it is his forte and his style to put this in a horror film like this. I'm assuming, based on the time it was made, it was to add some levity to it, to kind of balance out the darker aspects of the film. Nowadays, you might get people complaining about a film if it was made like this, unless it was a straight-up horror comedy, or it was more like Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. And now, if there's any real big problem with the comedy bits, it's Una O'Connor. From what I've read, James Wells did find her hilarious, but I find her more annoying with how over-the-top her shrieks are. I mean, it kind of fits the moment, but she's overdoing it a tad. It would fit more for a stage than for a film, and maybe that's more me looking at it from a modern perspective, because film acting has changed so much since the early talkies. That's one of the reasons why I try not to critique a lot of them as heavily when it comes to that. But with Una O'Connor, at least in this film, I can't help but do it. She's a little bit more tolerable in Bride of Frankenstein, even though her shriek is a little bit of a overreaction. But that one, it was kind of played for comedy because the monster was just looking at her and then she's just slowly turned into a screech. Whereas here, it's like, he's not dead. You don't have to screech like that. The rest of the side cast all do a good job, but it is Raines who steals the show, which apparently that's why him and his leading lady didn't really get along when the camera was off. But at work, you're not always going to get along with coworkers too. Well, nothing much else to say about The Invisible Man. It is definitely a horror classic. I don't know where I would rank it if I did a top 10 of my favorite Universal classic horror films. It would definitely easily be in the running, and I definitely got to give it a couple more watches. Could definitely say it was one that didn't really need a sequel, but we got sequels. I haven't seen them, I don't own them, so maybe one day down the road I will review them. But as a standalone horror film, it is great, and definitely comes with my highest recommendation if you are a fan of horror.